He thought it would be harmless fun to hand a broken piano to a quiet woman in a server's uniform, but by the end of the night, the only thing truly out of tune would be his pride. The Hale Foundation's annual spring gala glittered beneath crystal chandeliers that cost more than most American homes, their reflections shimmering across polished marble floors that stretched the length of the 8,000-square-foot ballroom. Waiters in crisp black vests moved gracefully between round tables draped in ivory linen, balancing trays of sparkling water and champagne as a string quartet's absence grew more noticeable by the minute. Thomas Hale, real estate magnate and primary donor, adjusted the cuff of his tailored tuxedo and glanced at his gold watch, irritation tightening his jaw. The hired musicians were stuck in traffic on Interstate 95, a detail that offended him more than it inconvenienced anyone else. Silence, in his world, was unacceptable unless he commanded it. Across the room, Clara Whitman carried a silver tray lined with crystal flutes, her black flats nearly soundless against the marble. At 36, she blended easily into the background, her brown hair secured in a simple low bun, her expression calm, unreadable. She had been working private events for 6 months now, choosing spaces where no one looked too closely and no one asked questions. Most guests barely registered her presence except to lift a glass from her tray without meeting her eyes. Near the far wall stood a grand piano, glossy but aging, its once perfect body dulled by time. One of the foundation volunteers had mentioned earlier that several keys stuck and a few strings were badly out of tune. It had been meant as decor, not performance. Thomas noticed it now, and an idea formed, sharp and careless. His gaze drifted to Clara just as she paused near the instrument to adjust her grip on the tray. "You," he called, loud enough for 3 nearby tables to turn. Conversations softened into curious murmurs. Clara looked up, polite but cautious. "Yes, sir." He gestured toward the piano with a dismissive flick of his hand. "Our band seems to have lost its sense of direction. Can you play? Or is that beyond your skill set?" A few guests chuckled, assuming the joke before she answered. One woman in a diamond necklace leaned toward her companion and whispered, not quietly enough, "I suppose. Anyone can bang on a few keys." The laughter spread lightly, like ripples in a glass of still water. Thomas smiled, satisfied with the attention. "Go on," he added, stepping back theatrically. "Let's have a little entertainment. It's already broken, so you can't make it worse." For a heartbeat, Clara said nothing. The room waited, hovering between amusement and expectation. She set her tray carefully on a nearby service table, aligning the glasses so they would not tip. When she turned toward the piano, her posture had shifted, just slightly, but enough to quiet something in the air. Under the warm glow of the chandeliers, she ran her fingers lightly over the worn ivory keys, testing their resistance, listening not just to the notes, but to the imperfections beneath them. And though no one in that ballroom knew it yet, the silence gathering around her was no longer theirs to control. The first note did not ring out boldly. It breathed, soft and uncertain, as if testing whether the room deserved more. A few guests exchanged amused looks, expecting clumsy noise from uneven keys, but Clara did not rush. She pressed another note, then another, mapping the broken instrument the way a seasoned sailor reads shifting tides. One key stuck halfway down, producing a dull thud instead of tone. She adjusted, bypassed it, weaving around the flaw without hesitation. The murmurs began to thin. Thomas Hale folded his arms, leaning back on his heels with an indulgent smile that suggested he was granting her a generous 30 seconds before reclaiming the spotlight. He had humiliated people before with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a well-placed joke. He assumed this would be no different. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, and in that stillness something imperceptible changed. Her fingers moved again, this time not searching but shaping. The melody that emerged was delicate yet deliberate, built from the piano's limitations rather than in spite of them. She avoided the sharpest dissonances and instead repeated a slightly flat note until it became intentional, transforming imperfection into texture. The chandelier light flickered across the lacquered surface of the instrument, as if even the room leaned closer to listen. At table 7, a retired music professor from Boston shifted in his seat, his expression tightening with curiosity. This was no random pressing of keys. This was structure. Clara's left hand established, a steady undercurrent, careful to compensate for the strings that had drifted nearly a quarter tone low. Her right hand layered a melody that rose gently, then paused on a suspended chord that seemed to hover over the crowd like held breath. The earlier laughter dissolved into something else entirely. A server near the doorway stopped mid-step, tray balanced at shoulder height, eyes fixed on the woman at the piano. Thomas felt it then, that subtle shift in attention that no longer revolved around him. He straightened slightly, the indulgent smile fading into uncertainty. The music deepened. What had begun as a simple sequence unfolded into a sophisticated improvisation, blending classical phrasing with unexpected jazz inflections that disguised every mechanical flaw of the instrument. The broken keys became percussive accents. The detuned strings became moody undertones. Each imperfection was absorbed, reinterpreted, elevated. Clara was no longer a server at a gala. She was command and restraint, precision and grace. Her posture remained modest, but her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had spent thousands of hours alone with 88 keys and nothing but discipline for company. The final progression slowed, descending into a whisper of sound so controlled that even the faint clink of ice in a nearby glass felt intrusive. And in the suspended silence between her last two notes, before the final chord resolved, the entire 8,000 square feet of marble and crystal held its breath, realizing that what they were witnessing was not a joke unfolding, but a revelation. The final chord settled into the room like a promise fulfilled, low and resonant, vibrating faintly against crystal glasses and polished marble before dissolving into absolute stillness. Clara allowed her hands to remain on the keys for one suspended second longer, not out of theatrics, but out of respect for the sound. When she finally lifted her fingers, the absence of music felt almost physical. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to recede beneath the weight of what had just unfolded. At table 7, the retired music professor leaned forward, his eyes narrowed not with doubt, but recognition. He had spent 40 years teaching at conservatories from Boston to New York, and he knew the difference between talent and mastery. What he had just heard was neither accident nor luck. It was discipline shaped into art. A single pair of hands began to clap. The sound was tentative at first, almost cautious, as if the guest feared breaking something sacred. Then another joined, and another, until the applause swelled across the 8,000 square feet of ballroom, filling the vaulted ceiling with a thunder that no hired quartet could have commanded. Clara rose slowly from the bench, smoothing the front of her simple black uniform as though she had merely completed a minor task. Her expression remained composed, almost shy, but her eyes held steady. She offered a small nod toward the crowd, not seeking praise, only acknowledging it. Thomas Hale felt heat rise along his collar. The attention that had once orbited him now centered entirely on the woman he had treated as a novelty. He forced a laugh that came out thinner than intended. "Well," he said loudly, attempting to reclaim authority, "I suppose we discovered hidden entertainment tonight." But the words fell flat, swallowed by the continuing applause. The retired professor stood, clearing his throat with quiet confidence. "Excuse me," he called, his voice carrying with practiced projection. "Miss, may I ask your name?" Clara hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Clara Whitman," she replied softly. The name traveled through the room like a spark catching dry timber. At the far end of the ballroom, a woman in her late 50s pressed her hand to her mouth. "Clara Whitman?" she whispered to her husband. "The Clara Whitman?" From Carnegie Hall. Conversations overlapped in low astonishment. 10 years earlier, headlines had praised a young pianist whose interpretation of Rachmaninoff had brought a sold-out theater to its feet. Then, without warning, she had vanished from the circuit. No farewell tour. No scandal. Just silence. Thomas felt the shift more acutely now, the realization dawning that he had not elevated an amateur for sport, but attempted to belittle someone whose reputation once filled auditoriums. Clara did not confirm the whispers. She did not deny them either. Instead, she stepped back from the piano, allowing the instrument to rest in its imperfect dignity. The broken keys remained broken. The detuned strings remained slightly off-pitch. Yet somehow, they no longer seemed flawed. And as the applause continued, rolling warm and undeniable, Thomas understood with uncomfortable clarity that the only thing truly exposed that evening was not the condition of the piano, but the limits of his own perception. The applause did not fade quickly. It lingered, layered and insistent, until even those who had laughed moments earlier found themselves standing. Clara remained beside the piano, hands loosely folded in front of her, accepting the recognition with a calm that felt almost out of place in a room built for spectacle. The retired professor stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing softly across the marble. "I attended your performance in Manhattan 10 years ago," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "You played Rachmaninoff as if you had written it yourself." A murmur moved through the crowd like a quiet current. Clara offered a small, respectful smile. "That was a long time ago," she replied. Thomas Hale cleared his throat again, this time without humor. He moved toward them, adjusting his cufflinks as if reassembling authority piece by piece. "If you are who they believe you are," he said, forcing composure, "then perhaps we should have arranged something more suitable than this old instrument." The remark was meant to soften the situation, but it only highlighted the earlier mockery. Clara met his eyes, not with defiance, but with clarity. "The instrument was sufficient," she said gently. "It only needed to be understood." The words settled heavier than any accusation. A woman from the charity board approached, her expression transformed from polite indifference to urgent admiration. "Miss Whitman, our program funds music education for underprivileged students. We would be honored if you would consider advising or even performing at our fall benefit." The request hung in the air, sincere and public. Thomas felt the weight of it, the realization that the evening's narrative had shifted beyond his control. Clara paused before answering, glancing once at the piano, its imperfect keys still reflecting chandelier light. "I stepped away from the stage because I believed my season had passed," she said quietly. "But perhaps I was wrong." The room absorbed her words in reverent silence. For years, rumors had circled about her disappearance, about pressure and expectation, about the quiet toll of perfection demanded too young. None of that needed explanation now. What mattered was what had just unfolded in front of witnesses who would not soon forget it. Thomas attempted one final gesture of inclusion. "Well then," he said, raising his glass, "to second chances." The toast felt smaller than intended. Guests lifted their glasses, but their eyes remained on Clara. She inclined her head slightly, then stepped away from the piano bench entirely, returning to the service table where her tray waited. The gesture stunned more effectively than any grand speech. She resumed her role without resentment, as if greatness and humility were not opposites but companions. The professor watched her go, shaking his head softly in admiration. Thomas remained standing near the instrument, aware that no amount of tailored fabric or square footage could purchase what he had just witnessed. The piano had not changed. The ballroom had not changed. Yet something fundamental in the room had been recalibrated. And as conversation slowly resumed under the crystal lights, one truth lingered in the polished air. Respect is never granted by status, only revealed by character. The gala did not return to what it had been before the music began. It could not. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different texture now, softer, more thoughtful, as if every guest had been quietly reminded of something they had once known and nearly forgotten. Clara moved between tables once more, offering sparkling water and refilling glasses with steady hands. Yet no one accepted a drink without first meeting her eyes. The same guests who had laughed earlier now thanked her with a sincerity that bordered on reverence. At table 7, the retired professor stopped her gently. "If you ever decide to return to the stage," he said, pressing a small embossed card into her hand, "there are halls in this country that would open their doors in a heartbeat." Clara glanced at the card but did not study it long. "I appreciate that," she answered, her tone warm but grounded. Across the ballroom, Thomas Hale stood near the piano, staring at the instrument as though it had betrayed him. In truth, it had done nothing but reveal what was already present. He replayed the evening in his mind, the casual gesture, the dismissive joke, the assumption that status could define worth. He had built towers of glass and steel across 3 states, negotiated deals measured in millions of dollars, and yet he had failed to measure the simplest thing in the room. After a long moment, he approached Clara again, this time without an audience to shield him. Miss Whitman, he said quietly, the edge absent from his voice, I owe you an apology. She paused, meeting his gaze with calm steadiness. You owe yourself a lesson, she replied gently. That is usually enough. The words were not sharp, but they carried weight. Thomas nodded, absorbing them without defense. The string quartet finally arrived. Their cases carried hurriedly through the side entrance, but when they began to tune, the sound felt ornamental rather than essential. Something far more significant had already filled the 8,000 square feet beneath those crystal lights. As the evening wound toward its close, a representative from the foundation formally invited Clara to collaborate on a national youth music initiative. This time, she did not deflect. I will consider it, she said, and there was quiet promise in her voice. Near midnight, guests filtered out beneath the glow of exterior lanterns, stepping into town cars and chauffeured sedans with conversations that no longer revolved around real estate or stock portfolios, but around a woman who had turned a flawed instrument into something unforgettable. Clara retrieved her coat from the staff room, slipping it over her uniform before stepping outside into the cool spring air. The mansion behind her stood unchanged, its windows bright against the dark sky. Yet inside, something invisible had shifted. Thomas remained near the grand piano long after most had left, running his hand lightly over its imperfect keys. He finally understood that refinement is not proven by what one owns, but by how one listens. And somewhere between the echo of applause and the quiet hum of the night, the lesson settled firmly into place. True harmony is not found in perfection, but in the grace to recognize brilliance where one least expects it. Spring turned to summer, and the story of that evening traveled farther than the marble walls that first contained it. Within weeks, a short video clip recorded by a guest surfaced online, capturing the moment Clara's final chord dissolved into silence and applause erupted across the ballroom. The footage was imperfect, filmed from a table near the back, but the sound was unmistakable. Invitations began to arrive, first from local arts councils, then from established concert venues in Boston, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Clara did not rush to answer them. She continued her event shifts for a time, choosing carefully, allowing the noise surrounding her name to settle into something steady rather than sensational. When she finally agreed to collaborate with the Foundation's Youth Music Initiative, she did so on one condition. The first performance would feature students from underfunded public schools, not her alone. The fall benefit took place in the same 8,000 square foot ballroom, though the atmosphere felt entirely different. Instead of quiet hierarchy, there was anticipation filled with hope. Rows of folding chairs replaced some of the formal dining tables, and a refurbished grand piano stood where the old one had once been, its keys restored but its history remembered. Thomas Hale greeted guests at the entrance without theatrical gestures this time. His handshake was firm, his voice measured. When Clara arrived, dressed in a simple navy gown that reflected the stage lights with understated elegance, the room did not laugh. It rose. She stepped to the microphone only briefly. Tonight is about them, she said, gesturing toward a group of teenagers waiting nervously near the wings. I was given opportunity once. It is time to pass it forward. The students performed first, their notes imperfect but brave, and Clara accompanied them with patience and encouragement, guiding rather than overshadowing. When it was her turn to play alone, she chose a piece that wove classical structure with improvisation, honoring both discipline and freedom. The sound carried clear and full across the restored instrument, yet those who had been present months earlier could still hear the echo of that broken piano beneath the polish. Thomas stood near the back, listening without distraction, understanding that the most important transformation of the evening was not financial, but personal. After the final applause, which was warm and sustained but no longer stunned, Clara thanked the audience and stepped away from the spotlight without lingering. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic flourish, just quiet fulfillment. Outside, autumn air drifted across the estate's manicured lawns as guests departed with conversations centered not on wealth, but on possibility. The foundation announced expanded scholarships for music education across 3 states, funded in part by donors who had witnessed firsthand what overlooked talent could become. Thomas remained by the stage until the technicians dimmed the lights, glancing once at the piano before leaving. He no longer saw an object to display status, but an instrument capable of revealing truth. And as Clara walked toward the parking lot under a sky scattered with early stars, she carried no trace of resentment from that first evening. She carried only the steady knowledge that when dignity meets opportunity, even the most imperfect beginning can become a lasting harmony. Winter arrived with a quiet confidence, and Clara Whitman's name no longer circulated as a mystery, but as a movement. What began as a single unexpected performance had evolved into a national initiative, drawing attention from arts organizations across the country. Yet she resisted the language of fame. In interviews conducted in modest rehearsal spaces rather than grand studios, she spoke not about comeback narratives, but about access. Talent is evenly distributed, she said more than once. Opportunity is not. The foundation expanded its scholarships into 12 public school districts spanning 3 states, equipping music rooms with restored instruments and funding private lessons for students who once believed concert halls belonged to someone else. Clara traveled quietly between cities, often choosing economy flights and small rental cars, arriving early to workshops where she sat beside teenagers at upright pianos marked with years of wear. She did not perform first. She listened. In Chicago, a 16-year-old student named Marcus hesitated before touching the keys, apologizing for his lack of formal training. Clara shook her head gently. "Play what you feel," she encouraged. When his melody faltered, she guided him with patience rather than correction, transforming uncertainty into rhythm. Those moments never made headlines, but they reshaped lives. Meanwhile, Thomas Hale followed the progress of the initiative closely. He had redirected a portion of his real estate profits into a permanent endowment for arts education, structuring it so that funding would continue long after headlines faded. He no longer attached his name prominently to the projects. The change was subtle, but real. At the Foundation's annual report presentation, he spoke briefly and without flourish. "We misjudge potential when we assume it must look a certain way," he admitted, his voice steady before a room filled with donors and educators. "I learned that lesson in my own ballroom." The admission did not seek absolution. It offered acknowledgement. By spring, Clara stood once more on a respected stage in New York City, not as a prodigy rediscovered, but as an advocate established. The auditorium held nearly 2,000 guests, yet the atmosphere felt intimate. She selected a composition that began with sparse, fragile notes, echoing the uncertainty of a broken instrument, before expanding into a layered crescendo of harmony and strength. In the front rows sat several students from the scholarship program, their eyes bright with recognition rather than disbelief. When the final chord resonated across the hall, the applause rose not in shock, but in gratitude. Clara bowed once, simply, and stepped away from the piano without dramatic pause. Backstage, she declined a lavish after-party, choosing instead to share pizza with the students in a modest rehearsal room down the corridor. The marble floors of that first gala were far behind her now, yet their lesson remained close. She had proven that dignity does not demand spotlight, only integrity. And as another season turned beneath city lights and open skies, the harmony she carried was no longer about reclaiming a stage, but about ensuring that no quiet talent would ever again be mistaken for absence. By the second year, the initiative no longer felt like a project born from a single evening, but like a quiet revolution unfolding state by state. Music rooms that had once stored cracked violins and dusty sheet music now held restored grand pianos, polished brass instruments, and shelves lined with fresh compositions. Clara moved through these spaces without ceremony, arriving before sunrise rehearsals and staying long after workshops ended, her presence steady rather than sensational. She refused luxury accommodations when traveling, often choosing modest hotels within walking distance of the school she visited. Reporters occasionally requested interviews framed around redemption or humiliation, but she redirected the conversation each time. "There was no villain," she would say gently. "There was simply a misunderstanding of value." Those words traveled farther than any headline. Thomas Hale continued to evolve alongside the movement he had once accidentally ignited. In board meetings across his real estate portfolio, he began asking different questions, not only about square footage and return on investment, but about community impact. He commissioned performance spaces in 3 new residential developments, ensuring that each complex included a small auditorium available to public schools at no cost. Colleagues noticed the shift in his tone. The sharp edge that once defined his authority had softened into something more deliberate. He no longer sought applause, he sought alignment. Meanwhile, Clara received an invitation that carried particular weight, a return to Carnegie Hall, not as a prodigy, but as curator of a national youth showcase. Standing once again in the historic venue where she had once felt both triumph and pressure, she ran her hand lightly over the edge of the stage before rehearsals began. The hall was capable of seating over 2,000 listeners, yet what moved her most were the rows of students gathering backstage, adjusting bow ties and smoothing recital dresses with nervous determination. On the night of the performance, the audience included educators, donors, families, and alumni from the scholarship program. Thomas sat several rows from the back, not in a reserved front seat, but among parents and teachers. When the lights dimmed, Clara did not open the program with a solo. Instead, she introduced the students by name, sharing brief stories of resilience and dedication. The performances that followed were not flawless, but they were fearless. When Clara finally took her place at the piano for the closing piece, she began with a gentle motif that echoed the fragile beginnings of her own return. The melody expanded gradually, weaving themes introduced earlier by the students, transforming individual effort into collective harmony. The final chord resonated through the historic hall with a clarity that needed no spectacle. The audience rose slowly, not in shock, but in shared understanding. Backstage, Clara embraced each student with quiet pride before slipping out a side entrance to avoid the spotlight's glare. Outside, the cool New York air carried the distant hum of city traffic, steady and constant. She paused for a moment beneath the marquee lights, reflecting not on the ovation, but on the journey that had begun with an imperfect instrument and an underestimated invitation. What had once been a test of dignity had become a testament to it, and the harmony she now carried belonged not to one stage, but to every room where potential waited to be recognized. Years passed, and the story that had once begun beneath crystal chandeliers became something far quieter and far more enduring. Clara Whitman no longer moved through rooms as a rediscovered headline or a symbol of unexpected brilliance. She moved as a mentor, a composer, and an architect of access. The scholarship program expanded into 27 school districts across the country, equipping classrooms from small towns in Ohio to inner-city campuses in California with instruments, instructors, and structured opportunity. What began with a single restored piano became a network of rehearsal halls, community recitals, and summer conservatories where young musicians could stand without apology. Clara kept her calendar full but disciplined, never allowing acclaim to overshadow intention. When national magazines requested features on her so-called comeback, she declined dramatic framing. There was never a comeback, she would explain calmly. There was only a pause. In private moments, she sometimes thought back to the marble floor of that first gala, the faint laughter, the imperfect keys beneath her fingers. She did not revisit it with resentment. She revisited it with gratitude. Because without that moment, the larger movement may never have begun. Thomas Hale continued his own transformation in ways less visible but equally deliberate. He established an annual grant for music teachers in underfunded districts, structured anonymously, ensuring that the recognition flowed toward educators rather than donors. At business conferences, when asked about leadership, he no longer spoke about negotiation tactics or market expansion. He spoke about listening. The most expensive room can still miss the most valuable person, he once said during a keynote address in Dallas. The line lingered long after the applause ended. One autumn evening, nearly a decade after the night that altered their paths, Clara returned quietly to the same estate where it had all begun. The ballroom had been renovated, modernized, its marble floors refinished, and its lighting upgraded. A new grand piano stood at the center, flawless and resonant. She was invited not as staff, not as spectacle, but as guest of honor for the Foundation's 10th anniversary celebration. When she entered, conversations softened not out of shock, but respect. Thomas greeted her at the entrance. No cameras, no theatrics. "Thank you," he said simply. Clara nodded, the acknowledgement mutual. Later that evening, she agreed to play one final piece. The melody she chose began with a subtle echo of that first improvised progression from years ago, but this time the notes were clear, the instrument perfectly tuned. Yet what filled the room was not technical perfection. It was perspective. The audience listened differently now. They did not search for novelty. They listened for meaning. When the final chords settled into the polished air, there was no stunned silence, only a deep, collective understanding. Clara rose from the bench and stepped back, not claiming the moment, but completing it. The room stood together, not because they were shocked, but because they had learned. And as the applause rolled across the ballroom once more, it carried a truth that no chandelier or fortune could manufacture. Never. Measure worth by appearance, because the quietest presence in the room may be the one capable of changing it forever.